Hello and welcome, Elnathan John. I welcome you all to a program of Exile Kulturkoordination. We are having an interview with Elnathan John from Nigeria today, and we are meeting here in Berlin. Good morning.
Pleasure to be here.
Nice to have you. So just some remarks to your biography. You were born in Kaduna in northwest Nigeria in 1982. You attended Ahmadu Bello University and the Nigerian Law School, where you obtained several law degrees. Your short stories, Bayan Lai and Flying, have both been shortlisted for the Caine Prize for African Writing, and your first novel, Born on a Tuesday, was shortlisted for the Nigeria Prize for Literature and won the Betty Trask Award. By the way, An einem Dienstag geboren, the novel, is available in German as well at the Wunderhorn Verlag. You write and speak regularly on Nigerian literature, media and politics. And in 2019 you got a working scholarship in non-German literature here in Berlin, and you were also in 2019 one of the judges for the Man Booker International Prize. For Born on a Tuesday, you got also the Prix Les Afriques in 2019. Last year, in Avant, a publishing house in Germany, was published your comic or your graphic novel, Lagos, Leben in Suburbia. So, welcome again, and we will talk a little bit about sustainable development goals and your writing, of course. Which readers do you want to address with your writing in general? Is there any message that is particularly important for you?
I'm interested in readers who are concerned about the human condition in places far beyond where they live, in places far outside their immediate circles. Mm-hmm. I'm interested in readers who, like me, wish to interrogate what is the status quo in terms of telling our stories, narratives, our histories, the way that people's cultures are told either by themselves or by others, and the relationships between groups of people regardless of the borders or the artificial borders that separate them. And for me, these readers can be anywhere, which is why I don't limit in my mind my readership to any particular geographical location. Even though, of course, when I'm writing, I ground it in the space in which I operate. So if I'm writing about Nigeria, I ground it firmly in Nigeria without a need to explain it away or water it down. However, that means that I'm also open to having people who have never even heard of Nigeria relate to stories. And that is why I say I'm interested in those who are interested in the human condition far beyond what sort of borders confine them to. Mm-hmm.
Have you already come into contact with the Sustainable Development Goals, either in your private life or in work?
Well, I've certainly read about it and about the goals for 2030 of achieving development without any significant depletion in natural resources. My thoughts on the Sustainable Development Goals are perhaps more critical than those who created these goals. Mm-hmm. And I'm not alone in this. There are several people who have challenged not just the feasibility, but the premise upon which these goals are based on.
What are the premises you look at very critical?
So for one thing, there have been several comments on what is regarded as the benchmark of, say, for example, international poverty. The World Bank, for example, pegs the IPL, or the International Poverty Line, at $1.90 a day. And many experts have said that even at this point, people are still poor. And so if that's the peg, then in the end, we will still have people in poverty all around the world, even if those goals are reached. Now, that's one thing. The second thing is that with the Sustainable Development Goals, it is based on an assumption that all countries want the same thing, even though they are signatories to this. It is also, especially in the minds of many thinkers, based on this neoliberal approach to development, which is that there is a certain sustainable growth that should happen in developing countries, which itself is tied to the idea of climate change. If we're going to have, say, for example, a 7% growth in developing countries, you know, what is the effect of this on climate change as a whole? Can we do this sustainable development goals and still meet the needs of our world regarding climate, especially as our activities in, you know, so-called developing are depleting natural resources at a pace that the world cannot recover from. And so there is that. Also, there is the fact that a lot of the countries who are signatories to these goals are themselves showing no actual political will, because we know that poverty is not a mistake. Poverty is actually a political decision. People make a political decision to leave people in poverty. We can see that from the huge budgets of many countries with regard to defense, and very lean budgets when it comes to development and education. And so people are paying lip service to these development goals, and the question is, how sustainable are they in fact?
Yeah, thank you very much. So we come, for example, to the point of corruption. You were talking while you were at Stimmen Afrikas and gave some interviews on the corruption, and that in Nigeria it at least came to a culture of corruption. So maybe you want to give us an example and how we could, or they could, break this circle of culture and corruption.
Nigeria has come into this, what we might call a culture of corruption, through very many means. One of that is historical, that the very foundation of the country itself is based not on the development of people or the upholding of human dignity, or in fact the fulfillment of the collective goals of the populace. What the country is based on the exploitation of resources by colonial powers. That exploitation and the violence that comes with that kind of exploitation was passed down to the people that received the reins of power from the British. Now, because of the way the country was structured, you know, with exploitation in mind, and the fact that the politicians who took over from the colonial powers like Britain continued this pattern of exploitation and exploitation not just of natural resources but of the population, we have the country open to this kind of rampant corruption. One of the ways in which this cycle can be broken is in citizens realizing their power, in being able to hold government to account, in holding the feet of politicians to the fire, in demanding reform, restructuring, and an adherence to the rule of law across all levels of government. Another way that this cycle can be broken is by advocacy groups working on improving things like voter education, civic education, so that people can be alive to their responsibilities and know that things are possible, and that it is possible to push and pressure a government into delivering on its responsibility. The Nigerian constitution demands that the Nigerian government provide for basic necessities for its citizens, and this is enshrined in the constitution. And once citizens are alive to that knowledge and that the responsibility to hold leaders to account, this can begin to sort of push the scales a little to force the hand of politicians to be responsive to the needs and demands of Nigerian citizens.
So the goal, the development goal 16 says peace, justice, and strong institutions. So I understood that you also believe that strong institutions demanded from the civil society would help to break, for example, this circle of corruption and gaining more peace and justice in a society.
Connected to the issue of peace, justice, and strong institutions is the different levels of justice. So we're not talking only justice in the legal sense, we're talking of social justice, we're also talking of economic justice. Without economic justice, you cannot have social justice. And without these two, any laws will simply be laws that are on paper. And we will have institutions that are weak, we will have corruption that is rampant, we will have violence that takes the place of normal social interaction between groups. And so one of the things that must happen is first recognizing the several levels of injustice that have been visited upon the citizens of countries like Nigeria by its government, by also international institutions and governments. You know, if we think of the way they are positioned relative to Nigeria and whether or not they are actually supporting Nigeria in achieving these levels of justice, you know. So, for example, how can we achieve true economic justice? We can achieve true economic justice if the government understands the need to treat citizens equally, and that institutions need to be built that support a citizenry that is in need of education, that is in need of healthcare, that is in need of urban development and rural development. Also a population that is in need of equal treatment across genders and across groups, whether they're minority groups, vulnerable groups, or majority groups. All of these things, you know, lead to the idea of social justice. And when we have that, then we have fewer points of contestation, fewer agitations, fewer points of violence that are driven by scarcity of resources, and people resorting to self-help because they know that there isn't a rule of law, and that when they appeal to government to right the wrongs that have happened, their appeals fall on deaf ears. And so I think that the current crop of leaders are incapable of achieving this, particularly because they are invested in a dysfunctional system. And this dysfunctional system is not dysfunctional by chance. It is dysfunctional by design, because without this dysfunctional design, people cannot enrich themselves illegally. You know, people cannot loot the resources of the country. People cannot live in, you know, stupendous wealth while their citizens go hungry. We also have a military and a police that brutalizes the population, which means that when there are protests, legitimate demands by people, government is able to bring out this huge stick, which is its army and its police force, to brutalize citizens, as we saw recently in the End SARS protests in Lagos, Nigeria, where many young Nigerians came out into the streets to demand an end to police brutality and accountability for all of the grave human rights abuses that the police have been involved in. These protesters were met with extreme violence, with guns, and with complete nonchalance from the political leaders that ordered these attacks on civilians. The hope is that as civil society becomes stronger and is able to properly educate the population about not just their responsibilities, but the rights that they have in a democracy and the ability that they have to enforce or to at least push for the enforcement of these rights, we will have a population that increasingly defies government by coming out into the streets to demand good governance, to demand an end to corruption, to demand an end to violence and extrajudicial killings, to demand an establishment of rule of law and functional institutions across all levels of government.
You were mentioning, of course, that Nigeria is still suffering from the consequences of colonialism, as so many countries in Africa. You are living since a couple of years in Germany now, and I would like to ask you how you see our development here in Germany. So all of the countries in the world have certain problems in common, I guess. So I would like to hear your view of the situation, particularly in Germany now. In terms of justice and these issues, social justice, political justice.
Germany is certainly grappling with its own challenges regarding justice at different levels. While one may argue that questions of economic justice are far less than in places like Nigeria, we still have many groups that grapple with life in Germany. We know that, for example, in places like the capital, very many people who are medium to low income people struggle, say, for example, with affordable housing in a city that is rapidly expanding. And in a city like Berlin, you do need affordable housing. And the question is, how do we create affordable housing, in a capitalist economy where profit is the driving force? And how do you balance the needs of a population with the needs of corporations and businesses that need to make profit and which drive the economy? And so we have that, of course. We also have climate justice, for example, which is a huge issue here. What is Germany's role, for example, in, say, meeting the goals of reducing emissions, by say 2050 or 2030? Is Germany, for example, in trying to meet its energy needs, is it capitulating on this desire to sort of reduce global emissions? We know, for example, that there have been several protests here, for example, climate protests, when certain projects were being done. So we have, environmental justice as a big issue that is still being debated in Germany.
So I'd like to go back to you as a writer. You have written satire called, or with the title, Becoming Nigerian, a Guide. And I would like to look at the issue of freedom of speech. If you would imagine to be a lawyer in Nigeria who has to defend a writer like you, so how would that look like?
Well, one of the things that has happened in the recent years in Nigeria is an erosion of the civic space, and one of the biggest things that has been affected by this is indeed free speech. I used to make the joke that it didn't matter what you say in Nigeria because the leaders don't even read, so you can say whatever you want to say. I used to say this in interviews, but I've since realized that this is not the case, because I know of several people who have suffered under even this regime, for example, after saying certain things that are critical of government. We know people who are in court or constantly being hounded by the police because of their agitation for a better country. We know activists who have been in and out of police detention because they made certain declarations regarding their intention to push for better governance. And that is a thing that for me is worrying, is concerning, because this gets worse, and the regime as we have in Nigeria is strengthening its hold on the public space. Recently, for example, we had the banning of Twitter in Nigeria, and for very many months Nigerians didn't have access to this microblogging website, which is very popular in Nigeria, because the president felt slighted after this website took down one of his posts, which was a very, very violent post that was made against a certain section of the country. And so in response, the Nigerian government limited access to this microblogging website in Nigeria for very, very many months. And they did this without consequence or repercussion. And this will only get worse, because once a dictatorship, whether or not this dictatorship is covered in the garb of democracy, gets a taste for extreme power, they want only more. And so that is why it is important that there is a constant challenge to this kind of erosion of free speech in a place like Nigeria.
I take it from some other interviews that you have a strong belief in the youth of in Nigeria, maybe in other societies in Africa as well. So what should we here in Europe know about this young generation you are thinking of?
And that's a good question. I think that in thinking of places like Nigeria, especially in Europe, it's helpful to think of many other things apart from the challenges. And young Nigerians provide a very useful window into what is happening on the ground with regard to, say, for example, creativity, with regard to development, and especially development driven by individual citizens, not by the government. And so we have many young Nigerians, for example, who are now in tech, and that is a scene that is blossoming, and many people in the global tech space are taking advantage of this. They're coming to Nigeria and they're looking at young Nigerians who are really, really into tech, whether it's software development or related things. That's something that is blossoming. We also have the arts scene, which is blossoming. We have a lot of writers, a lot of graphic artists, a lot of people who are working and producing literature, producing art, producing music, which is popular all around the world. We see that in global music streams, for example, where Nigerian music is taking the world by storm, and this is happening at a very, very fast rate. And anybody who's knows what they call global or world music knows that Nigerian music is very well represented there. That is largely due to young Nigerians taking their own development into their own hands and working in spite of this lack of support of government, in spite of a country that provides mostly obstacles to personal and human development. And so if you ask me what I would like people to know about young Nigerians, it is that they're very brilliant artists, they are amazing writers, they are brilliant at tech, and they're growing at a speed that we can only imagine. And that this young population will need a space to thrive in the next few decades.
So as you were talking about the young people and the young artists in Nigeria, I would like to ask you for a recommendation, for example, of a writer we should know here and a musician.
So one Nigerian writer that comes to mind is Ayobami Adebayo, who is the author of Stay With Me. She's an amazing writer, and I think everyone should read Stay With Me. For musicians, I would like to recommend the amazing Asha, who is a Nigerian-born musician and is doing amazing work with regard to music. And I think a lot of people might already know her, but it's worth more people listening to Asha.
Okay, two ladies. You recommended two ladies.
Yes, I
Two
did.
artists.
Yes.
And I would like to thank you very much for talking to you, and hope we meet again.
It's been a pleasure chatting to you, Krista.
Thank you.